Hello! In this video, we are starting chapter 4, which is all about alkanes and cycloalkanes. So we're going to learn how to name alkanes. We're also going to learn about a different way to represent a structure of an alkane, and that is using Newman projections, which are shown down below. They look kind of funny, but we'll talk about those later on. But first, let's just start by talking about alkane carbons. So if you have a single bond between carbon atoms, then this will be known as an alkane. So this is one of our functional groups, and remember that you should have those functional groups memorized. Because it will be really important as we move forward. Now, if you have a double bond between two carbons, then this is known as an alkene. And if you have a triple bond between two carbons, this is called an alkyne. Now, those R's that I wrote, those are just placeholders for the rest of the molecule or whatever carbon might be bonded to. Now, in this chapter, we are specifically focused on alkanes, but we will talk about the other functional groups as we go forward. So, one thing I wanted to talk about with alkanes, there are some different terms we can use to describe the carbons in an alkane. So let's say, for instance, we have a molecule that looks like this. So we've got a bunch of different carbons there. And remember, in bond line structures, we don't show the hydrogens, we're just showing the carbons. And then if we have anything like an oxygen or a nitrogen, we would specifically draw that. So the carbon on the very end of this molecule that I'm highlighting in red, that is bonded to one other carbon and 3 hydrogens for a total of 4 bonds. And this type of carbon is referred to as a primary carbon. And we abbreviate that with a 1, and a degree symbol. So again, this indicates that the carbon is attached to only one other carbon. And then the carbon next to that, in blue, is bonded to 2 carbons and 2 hydrogens. But again, we're not showing the hydrogens since it's a bond line structure. So this carbon would be considered a secondary carbon because it is bonded to 2 carbons, or it's attached to 2 carbons. All right, and then let's look at the carbon next to that in green. That carbon is bonded to 3 carbons and 1 hydrogen. So we would call this a tertiary carbon. So I'm just going to write 3C here just to save space. So that carbon's bonded to 3 carbons. And then what about, let's see, what color can I use? I'll use orange for the last one. What about this carbon? So that carbon is bonded to 4 other carbons, excuse me. So we would call that a quaternary carbon, and we use a 4 with a degree symbol. So that carbon is bonded to 4 other carbons. All right, so we can actually label these other carbons too. So any carbon that's at the end of the bond line structure, so it's just kind of dangling out in the middle of nowhere, Those would be primary carbons. So we'll label those as red. And then there's one carbon left, and it looks like it is bonded to two other carbons, so it would be secondary. So these are just things to keep in mind as we move forward. We're going to use this type of language later on to also describe functional groups and how many other groups they're bonded to. So we can have, for instance, primary, secondary, and tertiary amines. One student in office hours mentioned that this language is also used in biology to describe how proteins fold. So it describes the different structural parts of protein or DNA even. But this is a little bit different. This is mainly just describing how many things something is bonded to. Okay, so let's get started with how to name these alkanes or these molecules. So we're going to start by going over some prefixes. So this will tell us how many carbons we have in our alkane molecule. So for instance, if you have one carbon, that prefix is meth. If you have two carbons, the prefix is eth. 3 is prop, 4 is bute, 5 is pent, and we can go on. So I would like you to memorize these prefixes if you don't already know them, because this will make it much easier to name alkanes. All right, so let's actually look at some different alkanes and name them using these prefixes. So one alkane that we've talked about a lot is methane, which is CH4. So again, this only has one carbon, so the prefix is meth. And then we don't have any double bonds or triple bonds, so the ending of this name would be ane. All right, now next, let's look at a molecule that has two carbons. This would be called ethane. So eth is referring to the two carbons. Ane is referring to the fact that there's a single bond there. And we can keep going. So let's add on another carbon. So I'm just going to draw the bond line structure here. So we have 3 carbons total there. So that would be propane. So you might have used this over the summer if you were grilling. And then we can keep adding carbons. So let's add one more. This would be butane. Let's add another one. That would be pentane. We can keep going. This is hexane. Heptane, etc. So we would just keep adding carbons and then using the prefix to indicate how many carbons we have. And then we use the ane ending, so ane, to indicate that they're all singly bonded. All right. So now that we know the prefixes, let's also look at some rules for naming, because unfortunately a lot of molecules are more complex than this. So when we're naming molecules, we're going to use what's called the IUPAC naming rules, or the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemicals, or Chemistry. Let's see, did I get the name right? Chemistry, that's what the C stands for. Naming rules. So as scientists were discovering more and more molecules, they realized that they needed a way to name them, and that all scientists needed to kind of follow the same naming scheme. Otherwise, things would get really confusing. So this international union came up with these systematic naming rules. And let me actually write out the full name here. So the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. Okay, so according to these rules, what we do is first identify the longest carbon chain. So for instance, if we go back, let's say we have 5 carbons, and that's our longest carbon chain. Then we would use the name pentane. And then if you have something that is cyclic, so you have a ring in your molecule, you would identify the largest ring and name that. We'll talk about rings a little bit later in another video, so don't worry about that for now. Number 2, we would then list what are called substituents that are coming off of the quote-unquote parent chain. So for instance, let's say we have this molecule and we've got a carbon just coming off of one of the middle carbons there. That would be a substituent. Or maybe it's a chlorine or nitrogen or something like that. That would be considered a substituent, whereas the longest chain of carbons is the parent chain. Okay, so let's start with that. Let's just erase that chlorine. It's now a carbon bonded to 3 hydrogens. So let's identify our longest chain. So I'm going to start from left to right. So let's just start numbering. We have 1, 2, 3, and then if I go down, that only gives me 4 carbons. But if I keep going, 4, 5, 6, that gives me more carbons. So that would be my longest carbon chain. So I'm going to erase the 4 down there. And so that is my parent chain. Okay, so if we have 6 carbons, that means we have hexane. Okay, so we're starting to piece together the name. Now we do have that substituent down below. So this carbon that's hanging off of the parent chain. And that carbon is by itself, there's only one. So we would call this a methyl group. So the YL ending tells us that this is a substituent. And we'll talk more about how to name other substituents as well, but we'll start there. So now we have to indicate where the methyl group is on this carbon chain. Now there is another way we could have numbered this chain, and let me actually move my 5 up above. We could have named this starting from the right-hand side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that means that that methyl group is either on the 3rd carbon or the 4th carbon, right? So how do we pick which carbon it's on, or how do we indicate the location of that methyl group? So we could either call it 3-methyl to say that it's on the 3rd carbon, or 4-methyl to indicate that it's on the 4th carbon. So IUPAC decided that you should always pick the lowest number possible for your substituents. So we're going to pick 3-methyl. Now this does get more complicated as we see molecules with more than one substituent, because how do you number the parent chain to make sure that all of the substituents have the lowest number possible? So we'll get into that a little bit later too. Okay, so the name of this molecule is 3-methylhexane. So that would tell us that we have a methyl group on the third carbon in hexane. So we have 6 total carbons in our parent chain. Okay, so again, number 3 up above says number your backbone or your parent chain so that numbering is minimized. Okay, and if you want more practice with some of these naming rules, definitely go over Skill Builder 4.1 on page 135. All right. Now, there are a few more rules we have to go over. So number 4 says to assign di, tri, or tetra prefixes if a substituent occurs more than once. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. So let's say we have this molecule here. We have, let's see, 5 total carbons, but we want to use the rules that we just saw on the last slide to figure out what is our parent chain, and what are the substituents if we have any. And then if we have more than one of a substituent, we're going to add di if there's 2, tri if there's 3, or tetra if there is 4. So let me put that up above here. Okay, so let's number our longest carbon chain. And if you want to try this on your own first, you can. So try to see if you can figure out what is the longest chain of carbons. Okay, so I'm just going to start from left to right. So we have 1, 2, and 3. And I could have gone up here. It doesn't really matter as long as you just have the longest chain. All right, so that means we have 3 carbons in our parent chain. So what would the prefix be for that? Would it be meth, eth, prop, but? It would be prop. So this would end in propane. But notice that we have these 2 methyl groups coming off of that parent chain. So because we have 2 methyl groups, we have to use the prefix di to indicate that we have 2 of them. Okay, so let's write dimethyl in front of propane. So that tells us we have 2 methyl groups on the propane chain. But additionally, we also need to indicate where on the chain these methyl groups exist. So they are on carbon 2. So we have to indicate where both methyl groups are. So I'm actually going to write 2, 2 dash dimethylpropane. All right. So again, these are just coming from this IUPAC systematic naming. And it gets a little complex sometimes, but we'll get a lot of practice in so that you can kind of get the feel for it. So let's actually do another one. Let's look at another example. So I'm going to draw a molecule and I want you to try to name it. Okay, so this is actually the molecule that I showed you on a previous slide. So I would like you to try to name this molecule. So again, find the longest carbon chain and then figure out which substituents you have. and try to give them the lowest numbers possible. And then also give them a prefix if there's more than one. Okay. So again, pause the video if you're still working on naming this molecule. But let's go over this together. So let's try to number the longest chain here. So I'll start from left to right first. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so that's our longest chain. So that means that we have hexane. All right, and then it looks like we have 3 methyl groups coming off of that parent chain. So that means we have trimethyl. All right, so we have trimethylhexane, but we also have to indicate the numbers that, or the locations of these methyl groups. Now, I did number from left to right, but we could have also numbered from right to left. So maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so there's 2 options here. So the methyl groups are either on carbons 3 and 5. So maybe this is 3, 5, 5 trimethylhexane. So again, we have 3 methyl groups. 1 is on carbon 3, and 2 of them are on carbon 5. But I have to write 5 twice because there are 3 methyl groups. So it seems redundant, but otherwise we wouldn't really know where those methyl groups exist. Okay, so that's using the blue numbering system, but what if we use the red numbering system? There would be 2 methyl groups on carbon 2, so that would be 2, 2, and 1 methyl group on carbon 4, so that would be 4 dash trimethylhexane. Okay, but remember in a previous rule we said that we want the smallest numbering for the substituents. So which numbering system gives us smaller numbers? The second one, right? So that would be our correct name for the molecule, 2,2,4 trimethylhexane. And then the other one, even though it gives us a similar structure, right, it's just not following the rules, so we can't use that. Okay. Now the last rule, number 5, is we need to alphabetize substituents. So let's say we have more than one type of substituent. So instead of just methyl groups, what if we have other types of groups? Then we're going to list them in alphabetical order. Now we will ignore prefixes like di, tri, and tetra. So I'll show you an example of that. But there is a prefix called iso, and that indicates that we have a branched substituent. So I'll show you examples of that later, but that's our only exception to the alphabetizing rules. And it's okay if you feel overwhelmed right now by all of these naming rules. The IUPAC system is really complex, so we'll get more practice as we go forward, and we'll look at more examples. Okay, so let's look at a molecule and try to name it. Okay, and then we've got some substituents coming off of here. Okay, so try to name this molecule on your own, And if you get stuck, you can unpause the video and we'll go over it together. Okay, so let's try to find the longest carbon chain. So I'm just going to start by going left to right again. So we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I could really go either way here because there's 2 more carbons above and below. I'll just go above. 6, 7. So we have 7 carbons in our longest chain. All right, so what is the prefix for 7? Hept. So H-E-P-T. So that would be heptane. It's really easy to get hexane and heptane mixed up. So just remember, hex is 6, hept is 7. So you could even think of it as hex has an X and 6 also has an X in it. All right, so now we have to find our substituents and name them, and then also figure out where they're located on this chain. So we do have a methyl group up above and down below there. And then we have this 2 carbon group. So again, these are methyl groups where we have only 1 carbon. But then if we have a group with 2 carbons, we call that ethyl. So again, we're using that YL ending to say that it is a substituent. All right. Now, the way that we have our carbons numbered right now, we have a methyl group on carbon 2, a methyl group on carbon 3, and an ethyl group on carbon 5. Okay, but remember, there's another way we could have numbered this. We could have gone right to left. So in this situation, we would have an ethyl group on carbon 3, a methyl group on carbon 5, and another methyl group on carbon 6. Okay, so there's 2 different ways we could potentially name this molecule. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how to alphabetize these substituents. So methyl starts with M, ethyl starts with E, so which one should go first? Ethyl, right? Okay, so let's use the blue numbering scheme first. So this would be 5-ethyl, so 5-ethyl. And then we're going to put another dash and list the methyl group second. So according to the blue numbering scheme, methyls are on carbons 2 and 3, dash, and then we're going to use the prefix di to indicate that we have 2 methyl groups. Okay, so our first option is 5-ethyl 2,3-dimethyl-heptane. Whew, that's a lot. Okay, now let's use the red numbering scheme. So we're still going to list ethyl first, but in this case, ethyl is on carbon 3, and then the methyl groups are on carbons 5 and 6. Let me actually move this heptane. I'm going to put it more in the middle here. Okay, so we could either have the top option, so the blue numbering scheme, or the bottom option, the red numbering scheme. Which one gives us the smallest numbers? The first one, right? The blue numbering scheme. So that one gives us the smallest overall numbers, because in the second one, even though we're starting with a 3 for ethyl versus a 5, one of the methyls would be on carbon 6, and that's way higher than the other numbers in our first option, right? Well, not way higher, but higher. So we want to pick the first option where all the numbers are as small as possible. Okay, so that means our full name is 5-ethyl 2,3-dimethyl heptane. So you can probably see where this starts to get really complex, right? Now, let's focus on substituent naming for now. I just wanted to show you some different substituents and how we could name them. I also want to talk a little bit about that prefix iso that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so we talked about methyl substituents, we talked about ethyl substituents, but what about propyl substituents? So substituents that have 3 carbons. All right, so I'm going to use R as a placeholder for our parent chain. And then one option for a propyl group is just a straight chain of carbons. So we would again call this a propyl substituent. So there's 1, 2, 3 carbons there. But then there is another way that we could have 3 carbons as a substituent. It could be branched. So we have a total of 3 carbons there. And we could call this isopropyl. So iso is referring to the fact that there is some branching. This is also an isomer. Now there's another way that we could name this. Our longest carbon chain on this substituent is 1, 2, and then we have a methyl group up above. So we could also call this 1-methyl ethyl. So this tells us we have a methyl group on an ethyl substituent. All right, but isopropyl is a little bit easier. It's a little quicker to write, right? So if we were alphabetizing substituents, isopropyl would go before propyl because the iso prefix does count when we're alphabetizing. Now there are also butyl groups. So we could just have a straight chain of carbons in our substituent, and this would just be called a butyl substituent. Or we could have some branching. So maybe it looks like that. We would actually call this sec-butyl, sec-butyl. So that indicates that you have a methyl group at carbon 1. Now another name for this would be, let's see, let's number our longest chain, 1, 2, 3. So another name would be 1-methyl propyl because we have a methyl group on a propyl chain. Now, what if we have a different type of branching? We could have something that looks like this. This could be called isobutyl. So the methyl group is on the second carbon, and I'm actually going to draw a line here. So we could also call this, let's number our longest chain, 1, 2, 3, and then we have a methyl group coming off of carbon 2. So this would be 2-methyl propyl. And then the last option, what if we have a bunch of branching? So we have 4 total carbons, but they're all branched. So this would be referred to as tert-butyl, tert-butyl. Or if we number the longest chain, we have 1 carbon, 2 carbons, and then we have 2 methyl groups coming off of the parent chain for that substituent. So we could also name this, let's see if I can fit this in, 1,1-dimethyl ethyl. So that tells us we have 2 methyl groups coming off of an ethyl substituent. And we have to number it, so they're both on the 1 carbon. All right, so you can see this starts to get super complicated, especially if you have branching on your substituent. So it's okay if you feel overwhelmed right now. We'll do some practice with this. I'll try to post some worksheets that you can work through to kind of help you with these naming schemes, at least for alkanes. But we'll stop there today since I just threw a lot of information at you. Next time we're going to talk about cyclic alkanes, so alkanes that have rings in them. So this starts to get even more complicated. All right, so definitely take a break after this video. Let this digest in your mind, and I will see you in the next video.